Breaking down the shifting passing game landscapes around the NFL from free agency. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals over at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work at RotoViz, including the awesome rookie guide that is out. I saw that part 2 is dropping, maybe even by the time you're listening to this podcast, very, very soon. A lot of awesome work there. Shawn, you talked about it on our last episode when we returned from a bit of a hiatus. We broke down the running backs from free agency. Definitely, if you like this episode, haven't heard that one, go back and listen to that. A lot of discussion about the running backs. There's still so much more to talk about. We weren't able to hit on every name in the hour plus that we did on it. But you talked a little bit about the rookie guide as well in that show and how you have written a little more for it than past iterations. So that's awesome. For anyone who is a huge fan of Shawn Siegele's analysis, as everyone who listens to this podcast is. And so definitely something to check out and pick up. But yeah, today, Shawn, we're going to talk about the passing games in free agency.
We are. And I mean, first, thanks for those kind words there. It was a lot of fun to work on the guide. It is out. We'd love you to grab it. It's $20 for all 3 volumes. Ben, we had a good time even just before the show here talking about the quarterback moves, because in a similar fashion, but like a much more exaggerated fashion to the running back situation, which one of the things that was interesting about the running backs is, I mean, you mentioned these really cool, like 5-team or 5-player chains as they're essentially swapping one guy for the next, and how in some of those cases, it didn't seem like the moves necessarily made sense. Certainly didn't really move the needle for those teams from a reality perspective. Did create very interesting dynamics for fantasy, which obviously we like. But Ben, I mean, the QB is the position, right? You have Patrick Mahomes now going for the three-peat, working to, try and lock down his eventual legacy as the greatest quarterback of all time, has probably passed everyone other than Tom Brady. And depending on how you look at it, is already with Brady there. And once you're as dominant as the Chiefs have been, it makes it easier to add some pieces in free agency, something we kind of expect to see as free agency gets a little bit deeper. He's restructured his contract. That should help him some more. At the very other end of the spectrum, we have teams signing Jacoby Brissett. Now, in Brissett's defense, he has been actually very, very good, and he's had a chance to play in the last several years. But signing guys like Sam Darnold, we're also getting weird moves for players like Marcus Mariota. Now, we're going to have quarterbacks drafted with the first 3 picks in the draft almost certainly. We're going to have Justin Fields move to a new team. There are further dominoes to fall, and yet so much of what has happened already is very interesting, because it certainly would seem to define in many ways what's going to happen with the Pittsburgh Steelers, for example, a team that is always, they're always above 500 then, which isn't exactly the same thing as always being in the mix to win a Super Bowl. And I just right off the bat, that's an interesting one. Is like, is there any way, shape, or form in which their move gets them closer to a Super Bowl or just keeps them at that 500 point? But we have teams who have really already made their statement for the season, and then we have teams that are setting up the draft. We're going to have 3 picks at the top and probably another pick very short after. Then I like one of the guys a little bit later. I'm guessing that you have some enthusiasm for one of the other guys a little bit later. We could see rookies come in and make a difference in 2024. Obviously, everyone is hoping that someone else can be a CJ Stroud. But one of the things we know, quarterback, very difficult to project. Maybe your guy comes in and lights the world on fire. It's not always these guys in the top 5 or the top 10 who end up being the stars from their draft classes. Starting with Russell Wilson, or do you want to throw in a little Huskies?
I knew where you were going with that. My Washington Huskies quarterback, Michael Penix. I'm not that high on him, but I don't know that we need to make this a Michael Penix show and me give you my film takes on the Huskies. He's good, and it was not a surprise to see that he tested with huge hands. He throws a really good spiral, even up here in the rain in the Northwest. accurate. I always liked him more, his accuracy in the intermediate ranges. We would throw a lot on key third downs, even third and medium and third and short, fourth downs, 4th and 5, and things like that, because you trusted that he would be accurate in those like 7-8 yard completions that you needed, where I think other teams sometimes don't, necessarily trust those, the quarterbacks in those spots. He's really, and he has got the arm strength, so you can throw to the outside on those types of downs. People say that he's a really good deep ball thrower. We had a very vertical offense. I've mentioned this in some other places. I feel like he missed more, not more deep shots than he hit, but like missed more than he gets credit for. A lot of people talk about some of the highlight plays where he hit some of these deep shots. When you watched him every game, you realize he just got more opportunities to push the ball downfield than some quarterbacks get. And so, yes, some of them look fantastic. He does throw a good deep ball. I mean, like he throws a good spiral to all depths. I wouldn't say he's like a perfect deep ball, or he's not like one of the best deep ball throwers I've ever seen. He missed open deep guys at points in the season, which was sometimes frustrating, but then it was one of those things where the way the offense was structured, you're like, man, you can't miss those opportunities. And then 2 minutes later, we'd get another opportunity because you have 3 awesome receivers. Anyway, that's sort of my short thing on Penn. And not very mobile. Doesn't like a lot of pressure. We had a good offensive line. One of my concerns for him would be if, he's playing in the NFL behind a poor offensive line. Doesn't like to really step into hits a whole lot. I mean, he had a lot of injuries earlier in his college career, and so you can kind of understand it, especially at college, and maybe he'd be more willing to at the NFL level. Maybe, it was more about protecting his future, which I would totally understand. But some of the games where we got some tough pressure, the Arizona State game, for people who are like going back to film, they blitzed the double A gap pressure a ton. We weren't picking it up, and our offense was horrible in that game just as a result of getting pressure, and he didn't want to deal with the pressure and throwing the ball away quick. So anyway, that would be like I said I wasn't going to give you my film scouting take, but I obviously watch the Huskies very closely and have a lot of thoughts there. He'll be interesting. I'm not like, all in on him as a prospect, as a quarterback prospect. You talked about Russ. I think the fit for Russ with the Steelers, for Russ's sake, is about as good as it could get. And speaking of fit, we have another one, and they're tied together by a longtime stealing bananas foil, Arthur Smith. We have Cousins in Atlanta, which was really the fit that I wanted to see more than anything in this free agency period. Ever since they hired Zach Robinson and his background, some of his comments about how Matthew Stafford is basically the perfect quarterback, you knew that he wanted a drop back passer, which when we get into like projection season in fantasy football, the difference between Arthur Smith's offense and what an offense with a Kirk Cousins, it's twofold. It's the number of dropbacks that will turn into pass attempts when you have a drop back passer. And for Cousins, one of the big knocks on Cousins, he'll get good per down statistics because he'll do things like throw short of the sticks with consistency on third downs just to get a completion. Sort of similar to what I was saying about like the Penix stuff, where he's not necessarily willing to stand in there, take a hit, read out the stuff downfield. He'll take a 3-yard completion and a punt on 3rd and 8 rather than force something down the field. That's good for fantasy, though. Like, right? It's another completion on 3rd down rather than a likely incompletion. Cousins' offenses, his teams have typically always had good receiving production from fantasy. A lot of dropbacks are going to turn into pass attempts. The accuracy of those pass attempts are going to turn into completions at a much higher rate. One of the big stats on Kyle Pitts has been that his inaccurate target rate has been among the highest in the NFL over the last couple of years. And I'm not going to jump right into we should be all in on Kyle Pitts again. He's obviously somebody we're going to have to talk a lot about this year, Sean, again. But that is a positive, obviously, Ben, for him.
I have to tell you about this dream that I had. And I'm sure there are a lot of listeners who
Kyle Pitts' dreams.
Why are we hitting Sean's dreams on the show? About 10 days ago, I'm watching TV, and it's the first game of the 2024 season, and Kyle Pitts scores his second touchdown early in the second quarter. And I mean, just my entire body is suffused with all this panic, and it just like, we drafted him, and now we don't have enough. And
we don't have enough.
He's on the way to a 45-point game in week 1.
You had the first day of school.
You had to show up to school naked on the first day of school, dream about showing up to the 2024 fantasy season with not enough Kyle Pitts. That's what you had
in February.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I was being a little coy there, or at least trying to not get too high too early, but it sounds like you're going to be plenty in on Pitts again, Shawn. I'm going to be that's where I'm going with the way that the projections are going to shift. The way that I just talked about the number of pass attempts, which is both per drop back, but then the other thing I wanted to mention was the pass rate over expected was the maddening thing for Arthur Smith for so long. Last year they were, I believe, dead last. They were dead last for most of the season. I don't have the exact end of season numbers, but they were dead last by a good chunk. So I'm willing to bet that they finished dead last in pass rate over expected, massively to the negative. You don't pay a quarterback like Kirk Cousins that much money and then have that negative of a pass rate over expected. He is going to be coming back from an Achilles. There is some potential that early in the year they're a little bit more run heavy. They do have Bijan Robinson. I'm not going to say that they're going to be the most pass heavy team in the NFL, but even just neutral pass rate will add pass attempts. And then the per drop back, per pass play called, there will be more pass attempts. And then the quality of the pass attempts is a third element. All of those things are major increases and improvements for not just Pitts, but Drake London, for Bijan Robinson's receiving profile. He ran a ton of routes in year one, which was great to see. We obviously have a new coaching staff, not 100% sure how they will deploy their running backs, but it was as promising as you could hope for Bijan's rookie receiving profile, the way that it would go under a different coaching staff, that they used him that heavily in the passing game. There could be a lot more completions, not just attempts and all that, but completions, which is receptions, which in PPR or half PPR is points, is yards. I mean, it's all of it, but the catches themselves are points. Cousins, you asked if we were going to start with Penix or Russ, and I guess I just really wanted to talk about the fit with Cousins to Atlanta, because with Arthur Smith gone and Zach Robinson talking about wanting that type of drop back passer, and then Atlanta going out and making sure they get him. 4 years, $180 million, $100 million guaranteed. We know that Minnesota wanted to bring him back and made some, well, they weren't like dying to, but there were some last minute conversations about they're still making an effort. They didn't presumably not offer anything, but it just sort of became clear that Atlanta was not going to get beat. I think this was one of those, people joke, the tampering period is now, there's now a tampering period before the tampering period. This is one of those things that I think happened obviously before the tampering period. The report was out there that first day, and it became clear through back channels or whatever happens in these discussions with agents that Atlanta was not going to be outbid. They were going to get their guy. They're going to get Kirk Cousins because that's the type of offense they want to run, which is what, as a fantasy manager, you want to hear. That's exactly what, I mean, the team's decision-making and their move. Look, you just were talking about whether Russ can make the Steelers a real contender. I don't think Cousins can make Atlanta a real contender, frankly. I mean, it's a lot of money to pay a quarterback that's probably not one of the top 5 or even top 10 maybe quarterbacks in the NFL. But I think they're immediately the favorite to win the NFC South. He makes them better. And then for fantasy, the difference is going to be night and day, isn't it, Shawn?
It should be. You had mentioned some of these third down situations, and actually I was looking this up because I'm interested in how it relates to some of the things that the Steelers and Broncos were doing, how it relates to this Pickett versus Russell Wilson type of dynamic. But in looking at that and in selecting for passing attempts or dropbacks on 3rd and 5 or more, one of the things that we had last season was the Kirk Cousins finished second in adjusted net yards per attempt on those particular plays. Only has 56 of those attempts, obviously, because he misses a big chunk of the season, but second to Dak Prescott in that category. And I mean, we know that Cousins had a very good season last year, and we know that in part it's because you have the Dome, you have Justin Jefferson, you have TJ Hawkinson, you have this young dynamic rookie receiver in Jordan Addison. One of the things that I love, even though, you got to be careful about, overstating the value of it, just you go from that dome in Minnesota to a dome with the Falcons, you get into this situation in the AFC South where you're going to play an additional game with New Orleans in their dome. You're going to play a lot of games that are going to be very, very favorable for the passing offense. And then at least superficially, you have some weapons. Now, the thing that concerns me a little bit is that, I mean, they needed to add Darnell Mooney. And Mooney is an interesting guy because he has a season in there where he looks dynamic and he stretches the field. He's got speed. But you look at the Falcons last season, they only have 4 guys who run more than 200 routes. And 2 of those guys are the running back and Jonnu Smith, who obviously shouldn't have been that big of a factor last year, is no longer in the mix there. So you need a complementary receiver. One of the things that we witnessed with Drake London is basically we still have some questions, even once you adjust for the poor quarterback play and you adjust for what Arthur Smith has done. He obviously draws targets at an extremely high rate as a rookie. That number collapses in year 2. And as I'm mentioning that, what I'm looking at here is our ceiling signals tool, which is obviously built to give you a chance to look at some of the things that Ben often talks about in like the newsletter, right? And while we're there, the TPRR posts, 3 out of the 4 are out. You've got to be reading those because then you already know this kind of thing, which is that Drake London's ability to draw targets collapsed last season. We don't necessarily know that that's his fault, but as a result, the yards per route numbers, because you're not getting great efficiency, obviously, in either of these seasons, not fantastic. And even though Drake London is not in this group of players like a Quentin Johnston, where already after 1 year, history tells us that the odds of that player bouncing back, the odds of a Treylon Burks becoming something, I mean, those guys, it's not that they couldn't do it. And especially if you start to look, 10 or more years ago, you start to see examples of players breaking out in year 2 after a bad rookie year, or breaking out in year 3 after not doing much. But even though Drake London is not in that category at all, we still have some real questions about the ceiling, I think, that he brings as an NFL wide receiver. And, with Cousins coming here, he's going to be super expensive, right? To find that out, you're going to have to pay a lot. And to find that out, I was joking about Kyle Pitts. That was a very real dream. It was like the weirdest thing. I was like, I don't know if fantasy football is doing the right things to my mind if I'm having that nightmare in February. But Kyle Pitts had this amazing rookie season. We've seen him do it at the NFL level, and then we've had these 2 terrible years. Ben, there's a limited number of time or a limited number of snaps and years that you could have a guy really bust and not look like the same player, even if they have that athleticism, even if they have that season right off the bat. Now with Pitts, one of the things people talk about a lot is that he played the 2023 season at less than full health, but that's also not a positive sign, right? These players who are dealing with injuries early in their careers that sap a lot of what they were before that, I mean, those are legitimate concerns even as you go forward, even as you try and get fully healthy. So as we start to look at it from a fantasy perspective, I do think that there's reason for nervousness about what the production versus the likely cost on some of these fun players, what's that actually going to be?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it because, I mean, everything is going to be cost related. There are people that I saw immediately respond, we know Drake London is really good, and now he's getting the quarterback upgrade, so he should be awesome. I saw some tweets that were like, look at Kirk Cousins' number 1 receivers over the years. They've been this good. Obviously, Drake London's going to be awesome. And I guess to some degree, you can make that point about like his time in Washington, but like I just think it's a disingenuous point when you're comparing him to Justin Jefferson, right? Like there's a reason that Kirk Cousins' number 1 receiver in Minnesota was great, and it's because Justin Jefferson is great. It doesn't mean Drake London's not, but there were some ways of looking at this that were immediately writing off all of the concerns, and there are reasons for some concerns. When I did the TPRR write-up for Atlanta, I did find myself pretty interested in both of those guys, and I'll explain a little bit why. For London, his number did fall quite a bit from year 1, but it was really, really high in year 1, in part because their volume was so down. It was, it's a per route run thing when you only throw 480 passes. Their volume came up. He was still in a strong range. The numbers that I'm looking at slightly different than, because we've talked about this before. I'm often pulling from Pro Football Focus. The RotoViz numbers come from Sports Info Solutions. They classify routes a little bit differently. Regardless, the range that he then falls in, without me just quoting a bunch of numbers that might not match your source, still pretty solid in 2023. It comes down quite a bit from 2022, but not horrible. The other thing I like to look at when I write these up is him in relation to his teammates, and he was meaningfully higher than Pitts, meaningfully higher than Jonnu Smith still, who had a high year for Atlanta because he was used more than he probably should have been, and looked like the clear number one downfield player within the context of the 2023 Atlanta offense, which is still, I think, a relevant data point for him. So I think between his rookie season, where it was a really high targets per out run, and then a year two where he still looked like in a number one and added some after the target efficiency as well, he's got a nice yards per out run through the 2 years when you combine the targets and the yards per target, targets per out and the yards per target. I think his early price at wide receiver, I think it's about 26 right now, is very palatable, is what I wrote in there. And then Pitts is like tight end 10, which is like, I mean, when you look at it from an overall number, is cheaper than wide receiver 26. And for Pitts, yes, he's had 2 really tough years. Year 3 was his lowest targets per out run of his career. Year 2, like London, it was a lot higher, even higher than his rookie year, in part because things were so concentrated and a lot of lower volume that year. The volume did bounce back some in 2023. But you look at his 3 years combined and the volume specifically, because part of why he had such a good rookie year was some efficiency stuff that has fallen a little bit, but he wasn't like massively through the roof as a rookie in targets per out run. So now he has 3 very different looking seasons, and that's why I think it's interesting to look at it combined. His ADOT is north of 12, which isn't just high for a tight end. It's above average for a wide receiver. And he's earned about a target on about 22% of his routes, again, by PFS numbers. I do a weighted targets per out run number that tries to kind of mimic the Whopper stat that Josh Hermsmeyer created, I think, originally while he was at RotoViz. It adds in some air yards. It still puts more weight on the targets side of it than the air yard side of it, about a 2-to-1 ratio. Kyle Pitts' career weighted targets per out run is 0.60. You're not going to really have a strong reference point for that. That's over 1,185 routes, which is a good number of routes. The reference point I would give you on that is, to the listener, Shawn, obviously you've looked at this, but only 22 players in the NFL last season had at least 100 routes. So, I mean, even using a relatively small sample, and had a higher weighted targets per out run than Pitts' career number. And that includes, obviously, that second year where I said things were pretty spiked, but 0 of those 22 players are tight ends. His profile still, when you talk about that 12.6 ADOT I was mentioning, a targets per out run over 20%, it's still, from a volume earning perspective, the whole 3 years, when we look at it holistically, is still so promising for what that could mean at tight end. Now, I don't think he's going to put up that type of number on a per route run basis in a Kirk Cousins offense where there's a lot more dropbacks and there's more competition. I think the Mooney ad is really interesting to me as well. He is another one where I think the team context is really interesting, because you talk about how many sacks Justin Fields took. You talk about how much he scrambles. That's a key number we talked about on the show in the summer last year, where so many of the dropbacks don't turn into pass attempts, more so than any other quarterback in the NFL for Justin Fields. So you have called pass plays that don't actually, they're routes that don't actually become a targeted play. And some of that's on the quarterback, right? Some of that's probably on the receivers not getting open as well. But even DJ Moore, who had a great season, did not have an astronomically high targets per route run. No one in the Bears offense did. I actually think Cole Kmet is a really interesting, underrated tight end for, I think he kind of had a breakout season last year. The numbers aren't going to necessarily show because of some of these quarterback trends, but he was close to DJ Moore in targets per out run. Mooney was very, very low and not really a huge part of the offense. But I think you can, make some, apologist, arguments about that as it relates to the Bears offense.
Yeah, let me make that argument. In 2021, that year that Allen Robinson collapses, and there's that argument he's not even trying, and then we see the Rams sign him and that not work. I mean, Mooney goes for 222 fantasy points which you would definitely take at the prices you're going to get, or even something significantly below that. He has a 1,000-yard season. He averages 13 yards per reception, which he actually did last year as well, just on a number of receptions that don't really matter. And also almost 1,600 air yards and a 26% market share. The year after that, a 25% market share. I mean, these are numbers that are very, very strong number 2 complementary vertical receiver types of numbers. And I mean, for that reason, the rumors were that the Chiefs were really trying to get him as well. So it's kind of interesting that he would go to the Falcons and play there. I mean, it kind of undercuts my point at the beginning of the show, but play there with Cousins in this offense opposite these other 2 guys. And again, you can dream a little because, I mean, they could throw a lot of passes, gain a lot of yards, and ideally score a lot of points.
Yep. I definitely see him as a viable late round option as you're saying. When you look at it from a targets per out run perspective, the numbers I have, he was basically right around 18% as a rookie, got up to 22% in year 2, that year you were just talking about, back down to 18.6% in year 3, which is still fine for a guy with a high ADOT. That's a secondary number. It's a good number. Falls all the way to 11.8% in 2023. So that's kind of the point I'm making about how the 2023 Bears offense looked, and part of why his numbers were so poor last season. I think people are going to be really off of him. They were already kind of off of him after 2022 was not as impressive as 2021, but I'm right there with you that, and you go back to Tulane, he had an interesting targets per run profile in college as well as a late round guy, or undrafted. I can't remember. He was kind of an afterthought, right? Day 3 draft pick.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy who comes out and has that vertical profile and pays off. And that's what you're looking for when you make that particular type of pick.
Yeah, he was a 5th rounder out of Tulane and had some intriguing per route stuff in his college profile, I would mention as well. So pretty easy to write off his 2023 and be optimistic. I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic about him too. And I think he fits perfectly. Like you said, he's this complementary receiver that they need. It helps them put some stress on defenses vertically, which we know then Cousins is going to be able to work underneath. Like you look at like what TJ Hawkinson has done underneath Justin Jefferson. I mean, Mooney's not going to stress defenses the way that Justin Jefferson does down the field. But I mean, Cousins is a good quarterback for being able to do that. He can hit the downfield passes when needed, and he can take the underneath stuff when you start to stress downfield. Pitts is another guy that can stress downfield. I think that all works well for London when you start to think about where these targets come in. But I think it works well for Pitts as well. He's not going to only be running way downfield. And Mooney probably won't only be running way downfield either, but he's a good complementary piece for the health of the whole passing game. And anyway, you got to be really optimistic. We're saying a lot of really favorable things about Atlanta. I think that was some great notes about Mooney. Completely agree. And then I would, just to wrap up what I had been saying about Pitts, just the career volume, so strong. And the efficiency has been weak the last couple of years, but he played through some injuries last year, as we talked about. He's still so young. We've talked about the age stuff, right? Since day one, he was 20 years old when he played his first games, turned 21 in season that rookie year. He's 23 right now. He won't turn 24 until October. I mean, as far as like tight ends needing a little bit more time to develop, this guy came in so young. You would think that some of the route running and some of that stuff might have needed some time to develop. And really, like the way Arthur Smith used him, it's like, they wanted him to develop some of the blocking and some of that stuff as well. Or they just kind of gave up on that and then just used Jonnu Smith because he's more of a traditional tight end or whatever. But you can't write off Kyle Pitts. If you strip the name Kyle Pitts and you just look at the profile, the potential for the vertical and still somewhat target dominant per route profile, and then you think about the way that this team is going to add pass volume with Kirk Cousins, I mean, you have to. And then he's another year removed from what sounds like a pretty serious injury that limited him last year. You have to have exposure to that player at tight end 10.
And to sort of reiterate your point from earlier, in the Advanced Stat Explorer, I mean, you can look and see what the catchable percentage for these guys is. Kyle Pitts is last or lowest in each of the last 2 seasons. And part of that is going to be the depth of target element to an extent. But in 2022, he was at 57%. But only one other tight end was below 71. I mean, they're crazy numbers. So again, I was disappointed in Pitt's effort on some targets that I thought, I mean, you got to help your quarterback. You've got to play harder. You've got to show that you want to be a star. So I mean, we don't want to wipe this all away and say, you got a better quarterback. You got a real offensive coordinator. Everything's going to be fine now. I mean, I want to see him take a step, and he needs to do that to be a star again. But as we mentioned, the context is now much more in place.
And we get to find out one way or another. I mean, we've been telling people to draft Kyle Pitts for 2 years and then telling them that the context hasn't been there and it's been sort of an unfair shake for him. I mean, if we convince people to draft Kyle Pitts again this year, I'll at least say that it's not necessarily, one last ride kind of a thing, but it is sort of a no more excuses sort of a thing, right? Like, we should expect some improvement in a variety of ways. If he's not better than both the 2022 and 2023 seasons on a per game basis, like very early in the season, like out of the jump, then I think something's gone pretty wrong with his career that I am missing somewhere along the way. Because you go back again to that rookie year at 20 and 21, and he has a 1,000-yard season with a drop back passer, with a Matt Ryan, right? When he had that opportunity and that type of pass volume and that young. I mean, he can have a 1,000-yard season in 2024 fairly easily is the reality of it by tight end standards. So Cousins to Atlanta.
At that point, he's not somebody who is inflating the stats.
Right. So Cousins to Atlanta, certainly the prime landing spot for fantasy football of the quarterbacks. It was the most, exciting thing. We're getting something that we've wanted from this team. The opportunity to see these really exciting skill position players in a more traditional fantasy offense with a quarterback who can get the ball to his skill position players in an effective way and help them score, and has throughout his career. I mean, that's going to be so fun for the 2024 season, if nothing else, right? Like, I mean, whether they all succeed or not, I'm excited to see that. It's the most frustrating thing is when you see a player go through his whole career and never get the opportunity, and we don't really know whether it's injuries, whether it's situational, whatever happens. We don't sometimes ever get to know whether we were really right, because it can be so clouded. And for Atlanta, it's been that way the last couple of years. I think 2024, 2025, we're going to learn a lot more about these guys and what they actually are and what whether we were right on them. And that's fun. It's better to get to know. And Shawn, we naturally spent kind of a lot of time on the Cousins thing. We had talked maybe before the show about doing a couple different shows. We'll probably save Russell Wilson to Pittsburgh for our next show. So much to talk about with these passing games. You talk about where the quarterbacks land, where the receivers land. It's a little different than the running backs, where we're just like, okay, because the running back is more a piece dropped into an offense. And so it's okay. What does he get out of the offense? With the quarterbacks and the receivers, it's like, what does that mean for the whole health of the team in some ways? And so then we sit there and we spend a lot of time talking about Atlanta as a offense when you talk about the change to Cousins. We'll do a little bit of that with the Steelers with Russ next time. You at the top of the show mentioned some of these bridge quarterbacks, Jacoby Brissett to New England. We get Marcus Mariota to Washington, which you and I were kind of laughing about before the show, because they already had Sam Howell in place for cheap. And I understand a lot of people are down on Howell, but there was immediately a lot of reports that were like, okay, well, now Sam Howell's on the trade block. And there's going to be interest. He's going to at least be a backup. He was good enough last year. There wasn't really a need to go get Mariota. I also laughed at the responses there, which basically said, because they got Mariota and they have this mobile quarterback, now they're definitely going to go take Jaden Daniels. Who knows what will happen there, but Drake May has some athleticism too. And so I don't know if I would read that much into the backup quarterback decision. But they go and add a quarterback when they don't necessarily need to, but a backup, maybe not even a bridge, maybe just a strict backup. And maybe that's the case with Brissett as well. Those two teams pick second and third and will presumably both be going quarterback in a month and a half when they're on the clock. But those offenses, the Chicago offense with Caleb Williams presumably being the number one overall pick and Justin Fields unmoved to this point, and it sounds like not going to be a starter this year, not going to really fetch legitimate draft capital, at which point the Bears might just decide they have their backup quarterback with him. He's still relatively cheap on a rookie contract as well. What do you make of those three offenses and their moves this week and where they sit?
Well, one of the things that you and I have discussed a lot, and it also becomes just a huge talking point in terms of how teams are constructing their rosters. I do think the reality element of it is interesting. And we mentioned how the reality fits the prices, what you're actually trying to get out of the running back position if you do pay, or how little you can spend to get the same thing if you don't want to pay, how that has some ramifications for the rest of your roster building. When we look at some of the things that the teams are doing here, these moves that really stand out, you mentioned Marcus Mariota. The other one that jumps out is Sam Darnold to the Vikings, where it sounds like there's approximately $9 million guaranteed. The contract, maybe about $10 million. One of the moves that I liked, even though in some ways it seems like I liked from a reality perspective, really didn't like it from a fantasy perspective, but there was some sense to it as the Jaguars try and build their team. And you think about where they were at the end of the season, where if they don't have Trevor Lawrence, then you're going to have this massive drop to the second guy. I mean, if you're a team like the Vikings, why are you not making the move for Mac Jones as opposed to paying Sam Darnold? Because one of the things we're looking at doing here is trying to get the young player who is also an inexpensive player who also has a wider range of outcomes. Now, I know a lot of listeners are going to be like, you guys are only interested in Mac Jones, and that may just be me, and Sam Howell, because you've been on them in the past. But the reason that we've been on them in the past is that there are very strong pieces of evidence suggesting that these guys have NFL starting ability, and you want to see that, or at least test it. The same thing you were saying there with Kyle Pitts, you want to know. And when you're adding guys like Marcus Mariota, that's just purely lighting money on fire. Sam Darnold, a little bit more controversial in some ways because he's had some good moments over the last several seasons, but we have a much larger block of information suggesting that Darnold is a backup kind of somewhere in between, maybe like a Geno Smith and Drew Lock type of level. And if you're, a Seattle Seahawks fan, you're like, well, it's not great that you'd be sliding someone in between those two players, right? This isn't somebody who is going to become a Brock Purdy or is going to emerge as a lesser guy. You think, for example, like how much people were down on Jordan Love because every time he would go into these games, he would look so much worse than Aaron Rodgers. And then at mid-season last year, they're talking about, well, the rest of the season is going to be kind of an audition for him for like his career, for his life, right? Everything is on the line. And then half a season later, people are like, yeah, I mean, this guy could be in the MVP discussions going forward. Now, Mac Jones has had multiple seasons, but one of the things that I would note with him is that he had almost 4,000 yards as a rookie, and he was coming off of a season that was not dissimilar in terms of college to some of these guys that we really like. And you think about the situation there when you get the head coaching change with the Miami Dolphins, and Tua goes from being a guy who was a small, weak-armed, fragile bust to the player who has made Tyreek Hill a seasonal threat to the all-time receiving yardage record, right? And so you go back and you look at what Mac Jones has been dealing with over the last 3 years. He's got 163 targets to Hunter Henry, 171 to Kendrick Bourne, 219 to Jacoby Myers. Jacoby Myers is a pretty decent player, as you were much earlier on getting on board with that than I was. 117 targets to Nelson Aguilar. 20 targets to N'Keal Harry, 44 targets to Tyquan Thornton. He had 32 targets last year to Juju Smith-Schuster, who, shockingly on those passes, 2.5 adjusted yards per attempt. Right? This is a guy who has been surrounded by players who are either role players or players who should not be in the NFL. And when your offense is set up so the role players have to be the heavy target guys and the role players are people who shouldn't be in the NFL, the quarterback gets stuck with a very difficult situation. I think you go back and you look at the 2 seasons in college and then the rookie year, 3 and 4 years ago. And what you're thinking there is you get into a different situation. This is what the Jaguars are saying, right? It's like, we would prefer for this to be our backup. Now, the frustrating thing for fantasy managers is that there's really no level of play that Trevor Lawrence can get to where Mac Jones would ever start ahead of him. I mean, I say that there are situations where, the understudy does do some things, but I mean, Trevor Lawrence hasn't been particularly good. And yet, I mean, you're completely and totally blocked. This is just an injury type of thing. Whereas if you come in and you're there for the Vikings, and we don't know what the Vikings are going to do, but one of the things with this move is that there has to be a second move coming. And if you're going to be in a situation where you take a rookie who has a very wide range of outcomes, why would you not also want to have another player with a wide range of outcomes? In part because, I mean, this isn't the season that you're really targeting anyway. But the wide range of outcomes means you have two different guys who could hit in a meaningful fashion. And when I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, I like Kevin O'Connell. I love the coaching situation here. I mean, you look at some of the numbers that you mentioned to me, Nick Mullins, who the gunslinger. And one of the things that was kind of fun with Mac Jones is he was actually willing to try in that offense. And he kept getting in trouble because Bill Belichick's like, the only thing we don't want you to do is throw interceptions. He's like, the only thing I want to do is like get a first down at some point in the game, right? You have Justin Jefferson. You've got Jordan Addison. You have TJ Hawkinson. You have the Dome. I mean, that would have been perfect. I still think that eventually this is going to be a perfect situation for a different Vikings quarterback. But this is a missed opportunity, and it's a waste of money.
Yeah, that's, I mean, a really interesting perspective. The Darnold thing in particular, I mean, it just feels like Mitch Trubisky 2.0, where he went to the Bills and somehow rehabilitated his image without playing. And then there was talk that he was going to be signed as a starter, talk that he might go to the Giants, might go to the Steelers. He ends up going to the Steelers. He does end up getting to play some for Pittsburgh last year and is still Mitch Trubisky. Like, it doesn't change. Like, the Tiger can't change his stripes or whatever. Like, he's still Mitch Trubisky. Sam Darnold has played in a lot of bad situations. I know there's a lot of reasons to, and I do this with a lot of the players. I just did it with Kyle Pitts and the Falcons and all of that. There's a lot of reasons to say that, like, look, the Jets situation wasn't very good. The Panthers situation wasn't very good either. But he went to the 49ers last year. He sat behind Brock Purdy, and he never really played. He played in the final game in Week 18, and in that start lost to, and he was playing with backups, as you pointed out to me as we were talking about this a little bit before the show. But he lost to Carson Wentz, and the Rams were all playing backups as well. He wasn't particularly good. They didn't throw a whole lot in that game. He only threw 26 passes. He wasn't particularly accurate. He completed fewer than 61% of his passes on the season. He's never completed more than 62 in his career in a season, which is very low by NFL standards. Accuracy is in my opinion, arguably the most important trait. Like we were talking about Michael Penix a little bit earlier. If you do want to be excited about him, I think you would start with the accuracy, the hand size, the ability to throw great spirals, and maybe that can translate in the right offenses. I have a real concern when a quarterback cannot consistently get the ball where it needs to be at the NFL level or at any level. Accuracy to me is, and the way that it intersects with, spatial awareness and understanding and reading defenses, and what I would argue or have heard referred to as sort of anticipation and all of those things. A lot of that plays into accuracy. The quarterbacks that can use their head to throw to space and things like that, they end up looking more accurate. They don't have to throw perfectly when they can throw away from defenses and things like that. But to me, all of that is the same thing, and that's how you get a high completion rate. And that, to me, completion rate is a really important stat. Darnold has never really played with great quarterbacks, but again, like, this guy first career is under 60% completion. He's bearing down on 2,000 career attempts. You noted, like, we have a much larger sample on him, not somebody that, if you want a backup, if you want a bridge quarterback, I think the first thing you should look for is like a low upside guy who can be accurate and can keep you afloat. I was joking to you before the show, a guy like Case Keenum, who had a great time with Minnesota years ago, and has stuck around at the NFL level for most of his career. He came out of an air raid system in college, and he was that guy that could throw accurately, even though he didn't have the biggest arm strength and wasn't necessarily the best athlete, and physically was never going to be the prototypical quarterback. But when you needed him in a pinch to be your backup quarterback or your bridge QB for a whole year for Minnesota that year, he could at least get the ball to the places it needed to be, which didn't always mean that he was going to have great seasons every year or what have you. But that's the kind of thing I'm looking for in a backup. That, to Mac Jones's credit, he has a career 66% completion percentage. Last year, career low 64.9%, 3 percentage points higher than Sam Darnold's career high. And again, you just talked about how he's never thrown to anyone particularly effective either, and willing to push the ball downfield a little bit. And yes, he made mistakes and threw interceptions and those things, but I'm right there with you. I think, again, also you go back to his college and at Alabama and where he was so successful, a huge part of that was sitting back in a system with a lot of great weapons and being able to distribute and get the ball to them accurately so they could run after the catch and put up big numbers. And he did that all throughout his years in Alabama. That's sort of, so, I mean, in terms of, even if he wasn't the guy, I love your point about having 2 bites at the apple, and I don't think you're getting that with a 1-year, $10 million deal from Sam Darnold, who's probably not that guy. It's less likely that he could develop into anything. And also, you didn't sign him for any kind of long-term deal or anything anyway if he does hit. There's nothing there that is promising other than, I guess, it's not threatening to your rookie, right? Like, Sam Darnold's going to be bad enough that whoever they bring in is clearly the option. But other than the point where you made very well that maybe you hit on Mac Jones and if your rookie's not good, because Minnesota's not in position to draft one of the top names. There's some discussion they might get J.J. McCarthy, but he's expected to go pretty high. They might have to trade up to make that happen. They might wind up with a Penix or a Bo Nix or something a little bit less interesting in terms of the overall long-term ceiling. A lot of that still to play out, but if they don't hit on the rookie, to your point, they would have another option. Maybe Mac Jones does rehabilitate his whole career in a second place. We've seen Darnold in multiple places now. What he did in San Fran last year, he barely played. It was not enough to think that he's anything other than Sam Darnold. And that was in San Francisco, by the way, where everyone is efficient. Every quarterback who drops back in a Kyle Shanahan system seems to do well. So anyway, I think that's a really well put point. And then I think even just from the regard of like, okay, you hope that your rookie hits, you'd still prefer Mac Jones. To me, he looks like a great long-term backup. To your points about Jacksonville, I think Jacksonville made a really savvy move. They don't have to pay him a ton of money. And now if something ever does happen to Trevor Lawrence, they're still in a potentially win now window because they have a quarterback coming in who can at least distribute to the weapons that they have. Yeah, I think Mac Jones probably deserved better. I think that's a great point.
So we have the potential here for Sam Howell to move, and the rumors are that teams, maybe not teams that actually need a quarterback, so that's a different question, but that multiple teams do still have a decent grade on him. The Raiders, the Broncos, we've been talking about the Vikings, and then the Seahawks are teams that arguably could still address the QB position in a way that player would be the starter. Is there anything that jumps out to you here other than thinking, some of these teams are going to add those slightly deeper named rookies? The Broncos, I think because of Sean Payton, are interesting in that way. The Seahawks, it's almost certainly going to be Geno Smith, but they have refused to state that unequivocally. And there's enough wiggle room with the contract, and certainly the level of play last year was very poor. One of the things that will be interesting with the new offensive coordinator situation is whether or not they can actually use the 3 guys, because to have that embarrassment of riches last year and take a big step back was pretty catastrophic, and is one of the reasons why I think they're pretty skeptical about what Geno Smith can do for them. The Raiders are just so funny. I love Gardner Minshew. He played fairly well last year. He made Michael Pittman a lot of money. It's interesting that that's Gardner Minshew versus Aiden O'Connell, or at least that's the way it looks today.
Yeah, so many interesting spots there that you noted. From what I'm hearing and the discussion, it doesn't seem like the Broncos are going to be in on Fields. As far as where Fields lands and what's the best case for him, I've started to hear a little bit about Seattle, and maybe that's interesting. I had kind of been working under the assumption that with Seattle going and getting Ryan Grubb, noted the new offensive coordinator. He was the offensive coordinator at Washington last year. I talked a little bit about their offense being interesting. It's a little hard to know how much of that was Grubb and how much of that was head coach Kalen DeBoer, who Alabama hired. They've worked together at previous stops. But you would think that Grubb will take some of those principles, at least, which is spread offense, it's misdirection, it's movement, motion pre-snap, all the things that we've talked about as being modern and interesting. You being able to use multiple receivers. They have 3 receivers that got to go to the combine because their production was good enough. And so you just talked about the struggles last year to get a lot out of all 3 receivers. That wasn't an issue as much for the Huskies offense in college. At least it's going to be different in, against NFL defenses. But because of Grubb, I think people were drawing a lot of connections to Michael Penix, and maybe he lands in Seattle, and maybe it's Geno plus a rookie. And it would have to be a little bit of a later rookie, but that's, people have made that comparison with like Cliff Kingsbury, and Washington is going to find a way to get from number 2 to number 1 and get Caleb Williams because, Cliff Kingsbury was his offensive coordinator at USC last year. That one seems a little bit farther fetched to me because I don't know why the Bears wouldn't just take Caleb Williams, which they presumably will, no matter really what Washington is offering. I mean, if you trade out of that spot and Caleb Williams is a superstar, the Bears fans are never going to forgive you, right? So there is that element of, you better be right if you trade back and then you take Drake May at 2. He better be better than Caleb Williams.
And even Caleb Williams has a lot more risk attached than it probably feels like right now. But the level of risk dropping from him to the next 2 guys, both of whom are exciting, the risk is magnified so much that you would need a crazy amount in a trade.
Right. And the point I'm trying to drive home is just perception as well, that you're willing to give up that player. People don't care about extra first-round picks. The GM gets fired a year from now if Caleb Williams has a great rookie year and whoever they pick doesn't. If it's like a CJ Stroud, Bryce Young situation, you lose your job. But if Caleb Williams, if you just take him and stay put and he has a bad year, you get a little bit of leniency. Everyone thought Caleb Williams was going to be great. That's just the way that it works. But anyway, that
Caleb Williams is perceived to be better than Bryce Young. I mean, one of the things too is just that, the perception, you do have to hit, because if Drake May becomes CJ Stroud, then, again, you have to have both of those things. But it's fascinating and interesting. And it's exciting to think that we're going to get more players who, you're not going to get CJ Stroud, but more young stars.
Right.
I'm fired up about it.
We need that. I am too. But yeah, I don't know where Fields lands then. I do kind of feel like Seattle's going to wind up with a rookie QB. And so it's tough to pin down the different spots. Like the Giants might have been an interesting one, but they got Drew Lock from Seattle, which is part of why Seattle's backup situation is available, which is sort of interesting too in the regard of Drew Lock had one interesting start last year. I don't think he's very good. I think it's more like a Darnold thing, but I don't think Daniel Jones is very good, and maybe Drew Lock does start some games this year. It'll be interesting to. That's a quarterback competition I don't really want to discuss very much.
Don't drive down the Daniel Jones thing. He's gonna come back healthy.
Daniel Jones.
He's gonna be what we've always wanted, which is an extremely poor man's Josh Allen.
All right, that's something to look forward to. The Raiders obviously was the big one for Fields. Minshew, you mentioned that. That's another name that has bounced around as a competent backup / bridge QB for one of these rebuilding type years. I assume he'll just be their starter in Vegas and be fun. Minshew's the guy that should be starting on one of the 32 teams. But yeah, I don't have an obvious answer. I guess one of the places I thought about is like Tennessee. I'm not totally sold on Will Levis if Tannehill's not back there. Maybe Fields, similar to what you were just describing with Mac Jones and the other rookies, where it's probably Levis's team. But if Levis flames out, then you have some upside with Fields. I don't know where he lands. That stuff's going to be interesting. And those few offenses that are in play for rookies, and then also potentially in play for Fields that are left, those will be interesting to monitor for sure.
So, Ben, that's going to do it for our first QB edition of free agency here. We're going to have a second look at some free agent moves, some trade types of moves, and there'll be passing game part 2, but we'll look a little bit more at some of the receivers as well, what we can expect from someone like a Gabe Davis. You've got some interesting notes on him that you're going to share. I'm looking forward to that. We'll be back soon. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. I mentioned the Target Per Route Run articles. You've got to get over there and get them. subscribe to Stealing Signals. To do that, subscribe to Stealing Lines, subscribe to Stealing Signals Gold. We'd love to have you guys also at RotoViz. We mentioned the rookie guide. It is $20. Also, the coupon code RVRadio 2024 at checkout for 10% off our site subscription. I mentioned some of the fun tools today during the show. You get access to those. If you want to help me and Ben, the best thing you can do for us, leave us a rating and review. That helps us with the algorithm, which, as I mentioned yesterday, so helpful as we come back off hiatus here. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.